That's it. Well, welcome to today's webinar from the Open Group. We've had a little bit of technical difficulty, but I think we've managed to sort it out. Today's event is being brought to us by a very active member of the Open Group, Architecture Enterprises, and our speaker today is Craig Martin. Before I go to Craig to start his presentation, I'd just like to go through a few issues just to keep them moving forward. We would encourage you to ask questions. It's a really good opportunity to ask questions. The best to do that if you want a question asked directly by today's speaker is via the Q&A facility. If you do use that facility, please can you address that question to all participants, and everyone gets to see the questions that are being asked today. And what we do, we'll try and answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Any reason you have to leave today's presentation early for technical reasons, today's event is being recorded, and you'll get an email with a link to that recording tomorrow. So if you have to leave early, you can revisit today's event tomorrow and subsequently days afterwards. So Craig, you ready? Can I ask you to start your presentation?
Thanks, Simon. Morning, everyone. Apologies for the delay. It's a regular occurrence when I dial in. So I've managed to dial in over 3G. So I have a wireless connection, which I'm hoping won't give you all too much lag. Now we're behind schedule, and if you've heard me speak before, you know I have a lot of content. So don't panic if there's too many slides. The recording will be available, and we'll also upload the presentation onto SlideShare, so you can actually take your time through the slides. Probably it's worth your while just to someone who talks more than just reads off the slide. So listen to what I say, and then I'm happy to take some questions afterwards, and then also after the webinar. So what we wanted to discuss today was around the practice of architecture. In other words, how do we build effective architectural practices in some interesting changing market dynamics. So I'm going to touch on some dimensions of that today, but really just a quick blurb of who EA is. So some of you may know us. So we are a global organization, and we specifically focus within the niche architecture discipline, and that's from enterprise business right down to solution infrastructure, those aspects. So we have a global footprint, and that runs across strategy consulting, business development, which also includes resourcing and training and skilling, as well as creating practices and service model design, and developing architectural operating models. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be discussing today in today's session. So let's head straight into it. And I always preface talk with this. I'm sure you're probably all getting sick of it now, but for those of you that haven't seen it, I find it very, very relevant in the separation between the intuitive thinking and analytical thinking space. And what you see running across it there in that pyramid, so to speak, is what I refer to as a knowledge funnel. Knowledge funnel which takes these unresolved business challenges on the right-hand side. It has to push them through a series of processes, techniques, methods, whatever we want to call it, frameworks, to come up to robust, repeatable, and replicable processes on the left-hand side. And ultimately, that is our discipline. This discipline of architecture is to take these business challenges, help our business sponsors understand them better, and push them through this knowledge funnel far more effectively to be able to get to this repeatability. I refer to that as exploitation and reliability as opposed to exploration and validity. So I'm going to keep going back to this, but a lot of the architectural discipline has to do a lot with what we see on the left-hand side, which is very analytical-based discipline. Why is that relevant? Well, really what we see occurring is a shift within the market, and you're probably all aware of it. This is a traditional view of strategic importance and value versus complexity. And what you have at the top right, and you can overlay on this processes, you can overlay capabilities, you can overlay applications and those types of things on it. But we normally like to overlay a series of capabilities on this matrix. And what it talks about is this top right quadrant, which is highly valuable but highly complex. And that's mergers and acquisitions. That's the area where you can't actually define processes because it's in such a state of flux. What we have to do is we have to effectively, as we understand the space better, we have to admit, using the knowledge funnel down into the bottom right, start to identify what are referred to as core competitive capabilities or competencies. Now, at that point is where we start to sweat what we know about it, and we start to build repeatable processes. We start to understand more about how we can sweat it and squeeze maximum out of those processes. And that's where we use Six Sigma, Lean, Zero Constraints, all of those different techniques. Now, ultimately, once we've sweated and we can out of those processes, we will then push it to the bottom left quadrant, which is all about automation. And then to the top left quadrant, which is we pretty much outsource it. We push it out for other providers to handle for us. Now, what we're seeing is that that space on the left-hand side is getting bigger, faster. In other words, the things that used to differentiate us in the past are now becoming fairly commonplace, and I'll refer to that as utility. So the pace at which we have to take these innovative ideas and push them through this knowledge funnel into this highly repeatable sort of block on the bottom left there that's getting bigger, that pace has to increase. And really our job as architects to try and facilitate that increase in efficiency. And the is, well, is the top right quadrant getting more frenetic? Is that innovation space getting a lot more competitive? And yeah, I dare say it is, especially considering the demand for things like innovation frameworks, innovation methods and ideation technologies, to law, the ability to extract information from people that aren't your employees, all of that type of stuff is everyone trying to innovate more effectively in the top right quadrant. But the down occurs in the shifting of those ideas into the reliability space, and that's where the architectural space actually sits. Now, what we're actually seeing, and this is how we refer to a business model, by the way, which is a market model, a products and services model, and an operating model. That's actually getting put under a lot of pressure. If it's from the bottom upwards, which is the operating model space, a lot of the traditional space that architecture tended to play in, which was the technology area, is being outsourced. It's being pushed to the cloud. People used to get high salaries for doing those jobs. We can now put it out to a much more efficient support base sitting out of another country and pay less for those services. Sort of those aspects, the technology applications, information as a service, platform as a service, all those things are being pushed out. But what we're seeing up at the top is a awareness of business people on technology. And we see this when we have to do things like a digital strategy. It's difficult for a digital team to actually have much say in what the business wants to do, because everyone in that business who's so used to digital technology thinks that they know the most about digital and has an opinion to state about it, whereas no one has an opinion to state about how to originate home loans, for example. So there's this push from business people getting to know and understand technology more, and also begin to apply a lot of the techniques like business architecture techniques, kind of squishing it in the middle there. And then it begs the question around what role is there for the architect, and what role is there for the business architect in that particular discipline. Hopefully we'll get to the end of this presentation. I might be able to answer some of those questions. What we're also seeing is this shift in sort of broader economic models, the Creative Commons models, which basically talks about the fact that human knowledge is becoming more and more utility. And this space at the bottom is growing and growing to the point where the assemble and mix aspects that I need to be able to do are actually becoming more my differentiator. So if we as architects are playing in this bottom space, which is the utility and foundation area, we're really in danger of becoming dinosaurs. And we really need to identify and skill ourselves up into this innovate, assemble and mixed space, where it really looks at, okay, but once I have the utility, how can I mix those aspects more effectively in order to deliver the advantages the business is looking for? And not only be aware of everything on the utility layer, I also need to understand how to apply it and adapt it for those particular business needs. I see that quite often. I mean, I was looking at the APQC a couple of you can see that a lot of the utility space is becoming freely available. So things and utility models and operating models and business models that, we used to, pay a lot for in the past, those things are becoming utility. And now I can go and get an enterprise architecture management process framework from APQC and I can leverage that into my environment. So now those things are becoming standard, commonplace and utility. And we're in danger of this utility space getting left a little behind in that we're so focused on all those building blocks of a business, building blocks of architecture, that we're actually kind of losing focus on what the demands are from a business perspective around the innovative assemble and mix space. We see this through a few reports. So this one is from the Corporate Executive Board, which kind of looks at where are the top sort of CEO demands or the drivers that they're looking for. So customer loyalty is the top there, increasing flexibility and speed, and then you kind of get to reducing costs and increasing innovation. Increasing innovation will actually change a little. This report's only 2 years old. So there is separation between what the CEO sees as a driver versus what the CEO sees as a driver, and also what the CIO challenges are faced with, are predominantly sitting within the reducing cost area and the efficiency space. And we can see this in this report from Infotech as well. It looks at the gap exists between the CEO and the CIO landscape. And you can kind of see it, the large gap between the CEO seeing that one of these key drivers is maximizing stakeholder value, not shareholder value inside stakeholder value. So there's a large gap, 25 points, between where the CIO sees that as valuable versus where the CEO sees that as valuable. You can see down the bottom there things like managing risk, which there is a fairly large awareness that the CIO needs to manage risk, but really not seen as a main driver for the CEO, which is sort of an interesting view. We all sort of mention that's all about risk management, but I suppose depending on the industry you're in, I suppose if there was a government client, for example, you'd expect that managing risk piece to be a lot higher with regards to the business leadership. But all that's communicating is that there is a gap between the traditional CIO view of the world, in which the architecture discipline traditionally sits underneath that CIO space, and some pressures that are now being faced by the CEO and the business. And really, if history is anything to go by, there's not a good legacy out there. 46% of business failures are misguided strategies. Half of all business projects are failing. 1/3 of firms fail to achieve expected results. And there's a lot of interesting reports. I'll refer to another graph later just around how many projects do not meet business and CEO expectations. So there's this misalignment occurring across this of us taking the complex problem space in the knowledge funnel and pushing them all the way through to delivery on the back end. And there's a broken series of chains along that whole area. And really, the pudding is in the eating, as they say. So you can see here from the capability coherence score from that article, from the whole business review, if able to achieve that synergy, that would create suitable coherency or linkage from our market model, our products and services down into our operating model space, and start to actually get the organization able to work as one, being able to push those complex ideas through the knowledge funnel more effectively. There's a distinct and tangible value impact on our business by pushing at the EBIT. So this is the proof of those types of organizations that have a high coherency premium. In other words, their capabilities are mixed in just the right way to have high results on their financial reports. And the problem that we often find, and especially with the architecture discipline, is this concept of a mandate. A little crowded. But really what this talks about is this journey that the architecture discipline has had from its origins within the IT space, and as it begins to move up the curve. And we deal with projects that sit right across that spectrum. So, there are the normal EA IT architecture space, which sits at the point A, moving into the broader ERP-based stuff, large-scale transformations at an IT level, sitting at B. My business losing, training the quarter, find out why and fix it, which is improving business performance, customize product portfolios and product architecture, product bundling, linking design thinking, customer experience. Those things all take place in and then up into improving market performance, which is E, which is all about the mergers and acquisitions, things like cost to income ratio, shareholder value. Now, the tools that you need across that entire spectrum are vastly different. I mean, me build an architectural practice that requires needing to provide services for M&A activities, quite different from building an architectural practice that is needing to do desktop support and ITIL-based support within the organization. So there's quite a spectrum that the discipline needs to operate on. And what we've actually found in dealing with clients is that they spread themselves too thin over this mandate curve, realizing that they need to be providing this value in the top section, but then also realizing that they still need to provide what we refer to as the utility down here in sort of the A and B space. And we see architectural teams completely maxed out, sitting thin across this entire spectrum. And really you have to pick your battles very carefully around which projects you want to take on if you have a vision of moving up this particular curve. Really what you're focusing on is going from the predictable utility space right up into sort of more influencing strategy, and which is seen as a frontier bit of the architectural discipline, and on really helping the business define their strategies. And we can see this as well from, the report Fotech. You can kind of see here is, well, the CEO's actual experience of the architecture, and specifically the IT, sitting with the CIO level, is that it keeps business happy, keep costs low. It's all about cost efficiency and support. Whereas in actual fact, the CEO's optimal view of where he would like the CIO's office to help the technology space is to help extending business into areas and generating revenue. And then you can see kind of in the middle there is where the CIO as is versus future state is currently playing out, which is really in that optimize, increasing efficiency and decrease cost space. So from we can actually see there's still once again quite a gap between what the CEO sees as an optimal view of what the CIO and architecture and IT can do for him, versus actually what the CIO thinks is optimal, which is interesting, but it's kind of telling, well, do you have the mandate to do things that business is looking for? Well, according to this, the CEO is saying that, yes, I'm expecting you, that's the level I want to operate at. Perhaps the mandate hasn't been given to that CIO to begin to operate at that, and therefore it chooses a fairly low-level CIO optimal point that he can target and work with. So this causes that it's kind of linked down that space, which caused that, and it's a citation which I think I've really delivered. But what I found quite interesting was, this was the CIO, and here there was, actually was it last year, it was this year, there was an award for the CIO of the year, and we took a photograph of the screen because we found it quite interesting. Actually, the Chief Digital Officer that won the CIO of the Year award, and not what somebody would classify as traditional CIO. Now it tells you that there's a shift occurring within that base, and well, what is the role of the architecture discipline to try and help that? Can we see this as a fit or an opportunity for our function, especially considering the sort of vice grip on the discipline, the pressure which our discipline is under with cloud and all those things sort of gobbling up the bottom there, and coming from the top, pressure of business people knowing and understanding these spaces better and understanding technology better, and applying their own decision-making frameworks to how they want technology implemented within their different business units. So I just want to touch light on some of those who aspects. Some of those who's responsible for this. I don't say about a particular individual. I want to talk about disciplines within a business. And this particular one is a view of a business model. We presented this to a bank some time ago, in which it was clear ownership of what we refer to as the strategic architecture mandate, which is all about products and services, the market model space, and clear ownership below that of the sort of IT architecture mandate, which was the CIO space. But there was a very sort of area in the middle there that linked these together, in which seemed to be a clear mandate or a clear ownership. of who's responsible for that. Never mind just that piece there, but also just the functional and cross-functional bits on the side. In other words, who in the business is actually responsible for linking it all together? And there's a clear gap that I'm seeing in industry, and I'm often wondering why the architecture discipline is not filling that gap as well as it should. And probably a few of you on the call who may be sitting within that role, but really the ability for you to sit up at the strategic enterprise design planning space, and the ability to link it all the way through all of the disciplines, all the way down the stack. That's the role of the EA. It's not an IT person. You've probably reinforced this over and over again. It's not an IT discipline. It's the job to actually link all of these aspects together to bring context to business. And the problem is there's this confusion around disciplines. So whose job is it to do that? If we look at from strategic planning, planning discipline right to delivering and operating. I've just gone through an exercise with a bank now, looking at their architectural practice as they are being pulled into delivery and operating the bank. And you've got these senior architects who are turning away strategic planning opportunities because they're too entrenched in projects to deliver and know the value of the things that they originally architected. And thereby forcing business to go elsewhere and look for help outside of the organization. So distinct lack of clarity often around who does what and where does responsibility start and end within the organization, specifically when it comes to the types of disciplines that you and I are traditionally used to. And that enterprise design one is one that we're spending a lot of time focusing on, which is around how do we take an architecture discipline and human-centered design around it, and start to build in design thinking and then those aspects around people focus. So really enterprise design is a combination of traditional architectural business architecture thinking on one side and then the human-centered design thinking on the other, merging these two in the middle to create a more human-centered design, so to speak, for the architecture that we develop. Let's see where a few of the other disciplines also sit. And what happens is we get this misalignment from strategy right the way through to projects. And we often see this echoed in a series of concerns that we hear from our stakeholders. And here's an example of snatching of some of them. Are we in the right areas across the business? Strategic programs aligned. Are we actually doing the right things out there? There's so much activity. How do we even know that those are the right things that we're doing? And look and see through the eyes of the project management office is not well equipped to be able to respond to some of these questions, because they do look through a time, cost, and effort lens. They are also driven by quarterly reporting. So their paradigm is quite different from, for example, an architectural discipline whose paradigm is actually more long-term, 3 to 5 years. There's this conflict occurring between this quarterly reporting that I have to do for the share market versus, building something that is sustainable and reusable on an ongoing basis. And it tends to lead to this gap that exists between what the strategy is looking for and ultimately the projects that deliver those. Now, there's a variety of reasons which cause that, but let me just focus on the architectural ones that I see occurring. This occurs predominantly. This scenario one is the dominant scenario that occurs in business. And that's okay, we've got the mission, vision, strategy, there's the motivation model on the left. And coming out of that, executives will come back after a day-long strategy day and produce a series of initiatives. Those initiatives are handed off to different business units, and those business units go off and bring in their particular consultants that they work with, their teams that they work with, build business models and solutions based upon those initiatives. And this coherency, loss of coherency occurred way up at the strategy level because we have a unifying business model, a unifying understanding of how all the capabilities could fit together to create the value that the business was looking for. And it kind of fragmented early on in the cycle. And that occurs when we see the disciplines stacking up in this following fashion, in which we see architecture, and we can put architecture in there and we can put enterprise architecture in there, but let's just call it the architecture discipline, in which out of the strategic and business planning exercise, initiatives are given to Pro, they drive it, and often architecture is seen as almost an afterthought or stamp or something that you need to just get through, manage the architect through that cycle. That leads to results such as this, which kind of look at the 35% there, dark blue, that's the CEO's perspective. Projects did not meet business expectations. 35% of projects didn't meet business expectation. You've got 50% on the one side, but what's interesting here is the disparity between what the CEO sees as successful versus what the CIO saw as successful. The CIO on the left project exceeded business expectation. The 10% of the group that was polled felt that the percent met on 9%, but the group that was polled, 10% met those business expectations. But the CEO feels that only 5% exceeded those expectations. So you can see once again the echo of at the project landscape, the difference between what a CEO sees as successful versus what the CIO sees as successful, which shows that there's a gap in language somewhere. What's going on here? Why are we delivering projects at the PMO project level and the business is not seeing the value from those projects? So let's move to the next scenario to see how that could play out then in order to deal with some of those issues. And that's really around business transition space, where you do the same exercise, do your motivation, but instead of necessarily producing a series of initiatives, coming out of that you'll produce a series of capabilities or capability increments. And that'll help you define what we refer to as the business model. In other words, how do all of these pieces stitch together from differentiating capabilities to competing capabilities to just foundational capabilities? How do they stitch together to give me the value that I'm looking for from a business? And then back at that, how can I produce a roadmap and break that roadmap down into the different business units in a more planned, architected fashion? And that works is effectively moving the architecture space above the PM space. In other words, they're allowing architecture the headroom to architect and plan for the business and deliver a roadmap that the PMO team can take forward. Now, the challenge here is that the architecture discipline must stop being purist to a certain extent, is that we take quite a bit of time to get through this exercise. So you have to increase your efficiency. If you want to head into this space and play in this space, you have to push stuff through that knowledge funnel much more effectively, or rather, let me say, much more efficiently than what has traditionally occurred. And if you're spreading your team thin across the mandate curve, you're not going to be able to do that. So you've got to choose your battles pretty carefully. You've got to choose how you allocate your resources across the project space. You've got to manage supply and demand of your resources far more effectively across that mandate curve in order to do this. Don't jump into this space because you're not going to be able to deliver on time. Is often what occurs. You damage your reputation as an architecture function, and you're kind of once again relegated under the project management where they can crack the whip. So that's sort of the space of pulling architecture above. And then a few others which I'll just skip through quite quickly. So this relates to, going further up the stack. Architecture getting involved in the business planning and strategic planning space, in which you can actually go and produce a series of business models or business scenarios that you can play out in the business and overlay a whole bunch of content on it. Really show the business, or which of these sort of business models is more effective for you? Which one can you achieve with your current investment, current tactical pressures, and your current maturity and strengths and weaknesses? And that the business making a decision, what models is more effective, which one they'd like to play out. Taking that off through a series of projects and sort of transformational type projects. And the idea is that you've already done the architecture, you've already understood the implication of the business. You're one step ahead of the curve. Once again, you can see in the little graph on the top right, you must be equipped to be able to do this. You can't go and play in this pond without the efficiency to be able to deliver the outcomes that the business department is looking for. And we are still playing around in that utility layer. We haven't defined the utility effectively enough to deliver against this mandate. Then once again, we're going to lose reputation because we're not going to be able to deliver it on time for business at an architectural level. And that kind of looks to this model here, which is architecture moves sort of further up into that particular stack. into sitting between strategic planning in the business planning area. And really this is where this model starts to take shape, which I thought was some good research. It's a little dated now and probably needs a bit of update. I've seen it pop itself up in some reports along the way, and what it does is it matches the economic life cycle to the stock cycle and also to the types of models that were deployed at different parts of the economic cycle. So you see that as you have an upward trend in the economic cycle, there's a variety of models over time as businesses have matured, they've begun to do. Back in the sort of 1975s, only as companies were going down into a recession did they start to boot up a cost model and then a services model to start to optimize costs to try and help them out of the recession. And that occurred again in 1980 in that global recession. Only towards the 1990s space did suddenly people start to build new service models before the decline started to occur. And then as the decline was occurring, suddenly a whole bunch of different ways of rebooting their businesses began to occur. Different tools and techniques to try and do it. And you can see that has matured quite a bit. There's lots of activity looking at the 2000 dot-com crisis and this of the 2007. You can see that business is maturing in its understanding of the things that it needs to do to prepare for these types of crashes. And they do occur. There's a pattern that occurs, as you can see, and that the curves are getting closer and closer. So the ability for us as a business to be able to produce these types of models, these changes to business in a much more efficient way, is going to be the task of the architecture function to try and facilitate, use that word, facilitate. Especially those curves are starting to get closer and closer, which means we have to move through those funnels a whole lot faster in picking out those different models. And that really occurs both within that particular space of the architecture discipline sitting between strategic and business planning, as well as now in this enterprise design space, looking at how we can get a human-centered approach to dealing with our customers, our employees, and how they interact with the building blocks of our organization. And that's one area that I might just want to touch on as well, is this concept of an architecture services design, which really looks at, well, we build an architectural practice, and this is something we do for a number of our clients. We now begin to take more of a service design-based approach in which we look at the experience of the actual practice, and then we look at customer experience on the one side and figure out, well, how can the architectural practice design services at the customer? And often look through the lens of the actual customer, not just the internal customer. So how developing blueprints and roadmaps benefit a customer who has to draw money at an ATM, or a customer has to send a parcel from one place to another, or a customer that has to release a new digital product within a certain time span. What type of services can we provide that are actually going to help customers achieve those outcomes? And this is a sort of people-centered and human-centered design approach that we've found quite successful in a number of our global clients. What we've found to be quite good is to build what we refer to as these cross-functional and cross-discipline teams. The problem with architecture isn't the fact that we don't know our yard, so to speak. We have methods, we have frameworks, we have a whole bunch of things that we can call upon that puts us in that utility space. We often see the breakdown occurring more between the disciplines. And that's sort of the TOGAF model at the bottom. They're talking about the different disciplines. And breakdown occurs in the relationship between EA, SA, solution development, between project and portfolio management, all of those aspects. And I think quite successfully implemented is if you find the other disciplines in your organization that are also looking to operate horizontally across the organization. In other words, the finance team, they've got to look right across the entire enterprise and stitch it all together. So they're trying to get an enterprise view right across. And they're trying to optimize their organization to create greater business insights. So the strategy team, they're looking horizontally across the business. The business improvement team, they're looking horizontally. There's a technology team under the CIO norm, that's looking horizontally. PMO looking horizontally. Change manager, they're all looking the ones that tend to operate horizontally across an org structure as opposed to the vertical view. Get them in a team together. Call it an IBP team, a business planning team, an enterprise planning team, whatever the case might be. They're trying to achieve the same outcomes, just to coherency across the assets run across the organization. One of the things that prevents us from moving effectively through that knowledge funnel is that all of the aspects of capability are not dealt with when architects do capability-based planning. They focus only on technology. Well, guess what? Capabilities, people, process, tools, and information to drive out a certain outcome. All right, and the team constitutes those types of people. Creating a team that is a combination of those disciplines to be able to produce the outcomes that business is looking for I've seen that work quite successfully. All right, what does this mean from an architectural perspective? So let's look at the business of architecture. Now I start 10 minutes late, so I think I've got a time. We might go over 9, but it will be recorded and it will be on SlideShare for you to look at later. So if you have to go at 9, thanks for attending. So into this architecture practice maturity space, there's sort of 2 levels that you have to operate. You can go vertically into the level of architectural thinking, which is ivory tower on the top left. You know, bright guys sitting in a dark room somewhere, steering tables, so to speak. But the business doesn't know what happens there, and magic happens supposedly. Right? There's the bottom right one, which is we do architecture, but really only at a project level, and really kind of it's quite fragmented. So what we do is we've actually got to traverse this graph in a fairly clever way, because you don't want to do too much vertical up into ivory tower space. You want to be able to increment up and then deliver the value, increment up and deliver the value, increment up and deliver the value. And that's what you have to try and do over a series of months. And we haven't seen that somebody trying to move up that mandate curve up into the phase E of the mandate curve, right up at the top in mergers and acquisitions, to 18-month window. Which is long, claiming that we have to move fast, but there's a lot of politics that seems to play out, especially in the corporate space. Obviously, depending upon history, that can happen quicker, but you also lose credibility quicker if you don't do it right. So, you know, there's a window that you need to operate with as you move up this curve. And this is one of our own internal mechanism of how we do the business of architecture, by looking at the motion of the architectural practice specifically related to the mandate curve, what services they provide, and we present that through a catalogue and a communication plan. What capabilities do I need within my practice to be able to deliver those services? In other words, the individuals, the skills, looking at a demand analysis, demand and supply, sourcing, producing a roadmap, and governing that roadmap going forward. This is the little method that we use specifically to design architectural practices that get you to that top mandate curve, building a roadmap to help you get there. And I'll take you through sort of a couple of steps that lead you through that. So here's an example of a few. So here's the practice motivation model, and we use the motivation model, which looks at where we provide value, and on that we design a series of services. We produce internal communications packs, and then ultimately a capability model looking at the people, process, and tools of the practice to deliver those services and deliver the value required in the motivation model. And go through an exercise of assessing our own internal capability and optimizing the architectural operating model, specifically looking at things like demand and supply management, which tends to be a problem because the resources required to operate at that phase, the E level, are fairly limited compared to perhaps some that are sort of further down that mandate curve. So you have to figure out how to spread your resources effectively, and or even if you want to operate up in that top mandate area, and ultimately producing a sourcing strategy and a practice improvement roadmap. So here's a mock-up of a strategy and architecture motivation model. We use the business motivation model to document all strategies for business and internally. So we'd our own champagne, what we do for business, you will do for your architectural practice, looking at the external drivers and what are the goals and objectives required for that architectural practice to be able to deliver the value that business is looking for. Use a variety of co-design techniques. These are all Creative Commons, by the way. You can download these fairly freely. Understanding how these link, however, to a products and services model, understanding how they link to the business model canvas, all those things. we train people on those techniques. So here it's understanding, well, who's the customer, what's the sort of empathy map that we can work with to begin to follow a human-centered design approach, and then ultimately building a value proposition canvas of how they interact with our internal products and services, let's say at an architectural level, and then ultimately building out a service model, but looking at that sort of design thinking and co-design aspects, trying to get a better understanding. Because architects do like to do things in a room and then emerge with a sort of a ta-da effect at the end of it. And that way of designing, and I make that mistake often because we tend to be those types of thinkers. That designing and doing architecture, we need to move on from that to get into this co-design space and the Creative Commons, because our business wants to have access to all of these tools themselves, and they're doing it themselves, and sometimes correctly. So instead of getting on our high horse and trying to have control over that domain, we should become the facilitators of it more effectively across the organization. And that's a lot of sort of human-centered co-design aspects. That produces a series of services. Here's the team, here's a sort of top-level strategy and development, blueprint management, roadmap management, services that are provided through the architecture team to do those particular drivers and the ultimate goals that we're looking to achieve. And this is really aspirations on a page, specifically aligned to some of the goals that would come out from a business perspective. Tools, it's just a model, that's all it is. And it's different of looking at where value lies in the organization and how I provide that value as an architectural practice. But we often don't see these documented for an architectural practice. We don't see them developing these types of models to actually communicate to business. Well, these are services we provide, and the things they're going to help you with, and allow those customers to actually be involved in the process of co-designing those services with you, not based upon what you think is good to offer them, but based upon what they actually need. In other words, the demand pool as opposed to the supply pool. Huge area in which I think the architecture discipline is really weak in is ability to communicate these strategies more effectively. And do yourself a favor, get yourself a good designer on board that understands emotive factors around visualization, understands aspects of communicating messages to a broader business. These things are extremely valuable. We're in a generation of business people used to the eye candy they're seeing on the App Store, and they're expecting that level of eye candy back from the rest of the organization. And some of the models that architects produce are scary, for lack of a bit. So there is a lot around the communication strategy and communicating the services and the value that you provide to those particular stakeholders. And using a communication manual, even down to branding and coloring system, and looking at different types of colors and the types of emotions that those things work with within your stakeholders. All of those are needed disciplines within the co-design and service design space. That's, I think, just finishing off to this one, if I recall, just kind of drilling a little bit down into a little bit of the how space. And we're all familiar with the wagon wheels, or the circles. Really, just there's two hats that you have to wear. And I often find, it's like kind of like they did bonus six-hat thinking. You've got to kind of put different hats on at different stages. And an architect, you've got to wear two different hats here. You've got to wear this business hat, and you have to wear this architect's hat. When we go into a business meeting, we'll be wearing the wrong hat and communicating the wrong messages. We've all been there. We've all used all the architecture jargon, and we've had people staring back at us and the crickets chirping in the background type of story. So there's some lessons learned around, well, how do we communicate more effectively to business and the value that we provide to business? And there's this method of execution, right? In finding the right tools, not the stand stuff that I talk to you about. Yes, there are building blocks that frameworks and those provide, but you find in conjunction with your business sponsors, in conjunction even with your customers, what tools actually work for them, what models really work for them to answer the types of questions that they do. And this is in which we don't see much of. I mean, TOGAF talks about it. It talks about concerns-based architecture. It talks about views and viewpoints and how to use those. And yet, strangely enough, out of the entire framework, it's the piece that we see the least used amongst the community of architects. who do tend to produce a lot of what we call wallware. Nice diagrams, but who's the consumer, and what evidence is it? And again, I've made the same mistake. We've all been there. We suffer from that thing because we think it's cool. There is an aspect of leaving that legacy behind and getting more into the pocket speak of the business people, and understand which models and tools and techniques you can actually apply within that particular space. And then ultimately there's the traditional architecture hat. But at the end of the day, I've got to give a model that a solution architect can take forward. And you either have an enterprise architect that's too detailed and is disconnected from the business. You have an architect that's not detailed enough and is quite immersed in strategic planning of the business, but whatever they produce for the solution architect is adequate detail for them to carry their job forward. And a bunch of reinvention occurs, and guess what? We lose compliance. And suddenly they start doing things which really weren't on the roadmap and plan, leading to cases of business not seeing the lead that they were promised. So there is this balance that you need to do, and it takes a really good EA to be able to work between these two hats that they need to be able to wear. And that's something that I think you can practice within your own community, and just talk to your customers. What works for them, what doesn't. You present something to them, up on the wall, and ask them, hey, does this float your boat or doesn't it? And a portion of the time people look at you and say, I have no idea what you're actually showing on the wall. That means nothing to me. And you need to go through the process of iterating through that. Now, by all means, this is something I would show a business sponsor. All right? This is something that I would develop for a internal practice. As I began to understand, all right, I'm building an enterprise and do process modeling, but the detail required, all right, for a level below me. And I think that often I've seen architects, they're not quite how to connect it all together. So when I produce models, I should produce them that a solution architect or an application architect or an information architect can actually consume. But the business architect often won't necessarily understand that space enough, and they'll produce models that are too high level. So an important lesson for each of us is that you have to understand upstream and downstream from your role. What is it that works for them and what doesn't work for them? Not just focus on the upstream, but because that's where it comes from. But it's all about creating the linkage between these disciplines. All right, and then we get into strategy and architecture teams. Right, this is where we look at structure. We look at the capabilities of an architectural practice. We look at the products and services that are provided. So now it's okay. We've defined the services model. We've defined the motivation that needed to occur. Now we have to produce a series of capabilities to deliver that. And do things like capability maturity assessment, using some of the well-known maturity assessment frameworks out there that are looking at your internal practice. Where is it strong? Where is it weak? Where do I need to complement my teams and my organization? And another lesson to call out here is often we see architectural practices designing service models, but investing enough time in the capability space and understanding their capability areas and effectively improving internal capability. Everyone has to do their own things, just provide those services. So it is an exercise as an architecture manager that you need to go through in order to be able to deliver the value to those end customers. A whole bunch of team capability on here, looking at primary responsibilities. It's another variety, so to speak. But once again, models are good at communicating completely, which we architects tend to bear in our spreadsheets. So, looking at capability and team roles overlay onto your capability model, everyone knows what they need to do, what projects they can turn over, what projects they need to take on. And then ultimately going down into this demand analysis space in which we look at ways in which we can take the capabilities of our architectural practice and the services and how often those services are required by a business, who are the stakeholders that are called for those services, and how often does it occur, and can I begin to do a proper demand and supply management exercise of my resources? Because often this is where the wheels come off, because our guys and our team are too thinly spread across that mandate curve. So it's important to have a manager in charge of this area that is to allocate those resources resources to the right area. And this sounds like common knowledge. It sounds like, well, surely this is how all teams are run. This is how I schedule and manage my team. You find it actually, we don't actually find it that often, this level of rigor in around our team effectively across the high-value services. And that's very sort of the service demand and the type of NC required. In other words, what services are core, what do we want to partner with, what do we delegate, and what do we want to manage is really where you can begin to overlay your services over that space, and specifically looking at the demand for those services. And these are types of exercises that we do sort of repeatedly for our clients, as we try and understand, well, is there some way that we can outsource aspects of your capability and complement you in such a way? The same as the quadrant graph in the beginning. Is there stuff which is complex but highly valuable? Complex but of limited value for you as an architectural practice. You're not going to know what's valuable until you map it effectively to the business goals and objectives of the organization, not to your own internal business goals and objectives. That's the service model, and that's the motivation model aspect of designing a service. And then we produce these nice roadmaps, which, depend on your ability to absorb detail, but all we roll together onto one page, looking at what needs to be improved and where we can hide implicitly bits of activity to improve the practice as we begin to try and move up that mandate curve. And this can occur explicitly, and we can go and look for funding and budget for it. But a lot of what we need to do as an architect team is actually do it under the guise of certain initiatives. As you climb that mandate curve, that implicit something technique becomes, you don't need it, but as the business is beginning to see the value of what the architecture place and activity can provide, and you start to get actual budget for it, actual budget for that activity, for building the team, training the team, for tackling certain activities like mergers and acquisitions and all those types of things. So the journey that you want to be able to get your practice to that level where you're not having to implicitly hide these things under different projects. Good. Now, that's where I'll end because we're pretty much time. And that really just takes through a journey of saying, well, if we've got up to that knowledge funnel that we spoke about, in which there's all of these complex problems that we need to be able to deal with. And as architects, we need to be able to drive those problems through the knowledge funnel. We need to understand the heuristics. We need to understand how we can codify those processes and make them highly repeatable and risk within the organization. Well, you have to build the practice that can do that. You can't just do it without some formality in the architectural discipline. That's really the type of journey that I've tried to take you through here. Different styles and techniques that work, and some of them that don't, as you try and build out this architectural practice. So, once you have an effective practice, you're now in a position to figure, okay, where they provide value to the business. So, up and across a little according to that maturity graph, which was this one here. With that, work on practice going up a little, improve my architectural thinking, some of the services and techniques that I provide, then get them into the business, get the business using them. Well, the best way to do that is have business take ownership of them. In other words, they were involved in some of the original design of it, the co-design exercises. So that's really a very accelerated view of where we see the services of the architecture taking place, especially when the concern with the changes that are occurring in the industry. So that's all for me. Thanks, Simon. Over to you.
For that, you've raised some questions about the role of VA, where it sits in the business. So let's just go through a few questions. We are running a little over time, so we won't spend too much time. But a question from Mary Ann. I think this is a very typical question we've got so far. Mary Ann's asking, should business architecture sit within the business or within technology?
I think we know the answer to that question. But statistically, I have a report which actually shows that the success of business architecture initiatives, when they're business-led, is far successful and not IT-driven. So your business architecture function should not sit, I believe, under the CIO space. It should not sit within IT. It is not an IT discipline. discipline. Basically, an MBA, an accelerated MBA type of view is how we see business architecture. So it does beg the question, though, is that, well, if business architecture is a sub-discipline of enterprise architecture, but enterprise architecture is seen as IT, then, well, how does that work? So we have seen the business architecture function from popping out of the enterprise architecture function purely because of the legacy of what EA is seen as, and it's tainted with an IT brush, so to speak, and the business architects sitting with a value chain and sitting sometimes under the COO, but we would recommend under the Chief Marketing Officer or the Chief Digital Officer space for that particular function to sit.
A question here from Mike. How is correlation between architecture continuum and the solutions continuum typically maintained in practice in large enterprises?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's I refer to that as the bucket. And for those on the call who are not sure what that is, that's the almost a kind of physical separation of your building blocks within the TOGAF architecture framework. And what that means is that I will use and consume as well as design building blocks, and I will store them in my continuum according to certain layers and according to certain levels. And I see the role of the enterprise architect, and specifically the governance processes on the enterprise level. We normally focus on the architectural building blocks, which is the architecture continuum. And we create a separation between that team and the solution architecture team, which focuses on the solution building blocks, which is the solution continuum. And there talks to that view in which we spoke about earlier, that it's less about your own discipline and more about interrelationship between disciplines, which means that the process and governance and handoff between the architectural, the enterprise architecture discipline and the solution architecture discipline, it needs to be fairly streamlined. And really, that's where I see ownership splitting. So the solution architect team deals with the solution continuum space, and the architecture team deals with all your architectural building blocks above that. Having that through tools and processes and all the rest of that is an entirely separate discussion, but that's normally how we create an organizational separation between the two.
Thanks. From Brahim, does the architecture continuum building blocks represent capabilities required in the enterprise?
So remember that business is all about building blocks. So as architects, we use what's called a mechanistic metaphor. So we describe things in terms of blocks. We describe things in terms of a machine or an engine and those types of things. Funny enough, business doesn't see the world in that way. They see it in the form of an organic metaphor, which is a tree growing or a cloud that's constantly changing shape. And they can see the difference between an interview of the world versus this analytical view of the world. We've got to take this sort of cloud space on the side and down into this sort of mechanistic world of creating blocks that can create reuse out of it. The creation of those blocks occurred in the software space, in which we created modules. We created a modern application, like functionality, doing like things and like data. We grouped those together into a bigger building block called an application. We then grouped it together into a bigger building block called a system. Well, we grouped the processes and people to that, and we grouped that together into an even bigger block called capability. We then added another layer to that, and we got a bigger building blocks called cross-functional capabilities. We then created bigger building blocks called feature chains, which represented entire businesses, right to the top of the stack, in which the executives that sit on boards play with large building blocks in their entire companies. And how can they move these entire companies in different ways and mix them in different ways to create different outcomes? So the continuum is the bucket that stores all of these blocks, so that we have a place to go to and create some level of reuse from. So whether you're storing software modules and application modules and clusterings of those, or whether you're storing a higher level, more coarse-grained collection of components as capabilities, that all goes into your continuum, and you manage that across the life cycle of your projects.
Okay, thank you, Craig. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So I think maybe this is the last question should be from Robert. Robert's asking, what is your thoughts on the governance structure required for the new, more strategic roles that EA should be playing?
Well, I suppose it's an interesting question because there's different definitions of governance structure. I might have answered that in the talk, which spoke about on the previous question, which spoke about where we see these disciplines actually reporting to. And what we found quite effective is to take out that team that I spoke about, that hybrid team, which contains all disciplines, is to actually pull a sponsor from business, pull individuals from businesses, and then also pull all disciplines out of their different areas underneath, which have only sat under the CIO, and put them in a separate project-based unit within the organization, and call it a business transformation unit, or call it some type of planning, integrated business planning unit. In order to not ruffle too many feathers, we've called it a project that does planning for transformational activity. Over time, as they've shown their value, we've made it a full-time business unit, and we've avoided a lot of the politics. And that business unit has reported and been quite successful at reporting to somebody at the COO type level. Tends to have responsibility for all of those types of horizontal type roles and functions. So that's really the sort of space that I would see it operating at. But there is a lot of matrix type reporting and structure that has to occur within there, and a matrix model tends to be one that we have to all operate with as we report to a COO type, but also in the different value chain parts of the business, with retail or warehousing or distribution, whatever the case might be. We also have some dotted line into those particular areas, depending upon the function that you're working with. But I see it sitting within that COO space, mostly as we move up into the core value chain, Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Digital Officer role.
That's great. Thanks for that. I think this will be a good time to draw today's event to a conclusion. Craig, before we go, people have asked how they get copies of the slides. Where would be the best place they could do that?
So we will drop them onto our site share, and you can put down there, but also within the week they'll be on the EA website with the recording of the webinar or point to the webinar, as well as the point to the slide share that you can download.
Fantastic. And if anyone has any problems with any of that, you'll all have my email address, so I'm happy to act as the go-between to put you in touch with those various sources to get Craig's presentation. Craig, would you like to make any final comments before we end today's event?
I think I've spoken enough. Thank you all for attending, and I'll see you online sometime.
That's it. Thank you, Craig, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Please do keep an eye on the Open Group website, because we do have a number of events coming up in the future. So once again, thank you, Craig, and thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.